November 1944. The Third Reich is dying. In just 6 months, Adolf Hitler will put a bullet through his own skull in a Berlin bunker. But right now, nobody knows that. What they know is this. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army has already killed or captured over 2 million German soldiers. On the Western Front, Allied forces have liberated Paris and are pushing toward the Rhine. Every single day, approximately 30,000 German soldiers are being killed, wounded, or captured. 30,000. Every single day. And somewhere in this apocalyptic chaos, a 23-year-old German woman named Elizabeth is washing laundry at a military supply depot, completely unaware that in exactly 72 hours, she will become prisoner number 371842, in a system that will transport her 6,000 kilometers across the Atlantic Ocean to a country she has only heard about in propaganda films. When she finally sees America for the first time, what she discovers will shatter every single belief she holds about the enemy. What she witnesses will make her question everything, and what she learns about herself in that moment will haunt her for the rest of her life. This is December 1944. Elizabeth has just been captured. She did not resist. How could she? One moment she was sorting through a pile of German military uniforms. The next moment, American soldiers were everywhere. They moved through the camp like water through broken pipes. Fast, efficient, unstoppable. Elizabeth heard shouting in English. She heard German officers screaming contradictory orders. She heard gunfire in the distance. And then she heard nothing but her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as a young American soldier pointed his rifle at her and gestured for her to raise her hands. She raised them. What else was there to do? The processing happened quickly. Too quickly for Elizabeth to understand what was happening. She was gathered with other women, clerks, cooks, laundry workers, seamstresses. None of them were soldiers. None of them had ever fired a weapon. But they had worked for the German military, and that made them prisoners of war. The classification felt absurd to Elizabeth. She had grown up in a town of 3,000 people. She had taken this job because refusing was not an option. She had expected to go home after the war ended. Instead, soldiers loaded her onto a truck heading toward the coast. She carried one small bag. Inside it, a hairbrush, a comb, one extra shirt. These were the only possessions that would make the journey with her. Everything else, her entire life, was left behind in a supply depot that American forces were already dismantling. The truck ride lasted 7 hours. Elizabeth did not speak. Neither did the other women. What was there to say? They watched German landscape pass by through gaps in the canvas covering. They saw destroyed villages. They saw columns of refugees walking nowhere. They saw the corpse of their country decomposing in real time. And they understood without anyone telling them that they would probably never see this land again. When the truck reached the harbor, Elizabeth saw the ship. It was massive, gray, crowded with guards and prisoners already being loaded through multiple gangways. Men were being separated from women. Everyone was being directed to different sections of the vessel. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. The ocean stretched out behind the ship like an infinite gray void. She had never seen the ocean before. She had never been more than 50 kilometers from her hometown before. And now she was about to cross the Atlantic. The boarding process took 3 hours. Elizabeth was assigned a bunk in a compartment with 40 other women. The space was cramped but clean. The guards gave instructions through interpreters. Rules were explained. Schedules were established. And then the ship began to move. Elizabeth felt the vibration through the metal walls. She felt the slight tilt as the vessel turned toward open water. She felt Germany disappearing behind her. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Relief. The air raid sirens could not reach her here. The bombs could not find her in the middle of the ocean. For the first time in 3 years, she would sleep without wondering if she would wake up. The voyage took 18 days. During those 18 days, Elizabeth learned things that confused her deeply. The American guards were not cruel. They did not shout. They did not hit. When language barriers created problems, they used gestures and patience instead of violence. Meals were served 3 times daily. The food was simple but adequate. And slowly, impossibly, rumors began spreading through the prisoner compartments. They were not going to England. They were not going to France. They were going to America. America. Elizabeth refused to believe it at first. America was 6,000 kilometers away. America was a place from movies and propaganda. America was the land of gangsters and cowboys and unlimited everything. It could not possibly be their destination. But as the days passed and the ship kept moving west, the rumors became harder to dismiss. On the morning of the 19th day, a voice announced that land was ahead. Elizabeth pushed through the crowd of women rushing toward the railings. She climbed onto a crate to see over taller heads. She looked out at the approaching coastline, and in that moment, her brain simply stopped functioning. She had expected destruction. She had expected chaos. She had expected a port that looked like every German port she had seen in the past 3 years. Bombed, burned, desperate. Instead, she saw something that made no logical sense. The American port was operating normally. Cranes were moving cargo. Trucks were lined up in orderly rows. Workers were walking, not running. Nobody was looking at the sky. Nobody was rushing for shelter. Nobody showed any sign of fear or urgency. It was a regular workday. A completely regular workday. While 6,000 kilometers away, German cities were burning, and millions were dying, and the entire European continent was drowning in blood. Elizabeth gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. She had spent 3 years living under constant bombardment. She had learned to sleep through air raid sirens because exhaustion eventually defeats fear. She had watched neighbors pull dead children from collapsed buildings. She had eaten bread stretched with sawdust because real flour had disappeared. She had forgotten what butter tasted like. She had forgotten what safety felt like. And now she was staring at a country that seemed to exist in a completely different reality. The guards near the docks were leaning on railings. They were chatting with each other. They were pointing at the ship casually, like this was just another delivery. No tension, no urgency, no fear. Elizabeth understood in that moment something that German propaganda had never mentioned. America was not fighting this war. America was manufacturing this war. The war was something that happened over there across the ocean, far away from these clean docks and functioning cranes and well-fed workers in new uniforms. The disparity was so vast that Elizabeth could not process it. When she finally stepped onto American soil, her legs nearly buckled. Not from weakness, from shock. The ground beneath her feet was clean. The air smelled like salt and machinery, not smoke and death. Guards directed prisoners with calm gestures, no shouting, no hitting, no threatening. Elizabeth walked where they pointed, because walking was the only thing she could make her body do. The processing facility was efficient. Name, age, birthplace, occupation. Each question was translated, answered, typed into forms. Elizabeth received an identification number. She received clean uniforms. She received bedding. Everything was organized. Everything was systematic. Everything was the opposite of the chaos she had left behind. And then came the first meal. Elizabeth sat down at a long table in the dining hall. A tray was placed in front of her. On it, soft white bread, real butter jam, warm vegetables, potatoes. She stared at the food. She could not move. She could not breathe. She had not seen bread like this in years. Real bread. White bread. Bread that was not stretched with sawdust or fillers or whatever else desperate bakers had been using to make supplies last longer. She picked up the bread. It was soft. It was fresh. It was impossible. When she took the first bite, her hand started shaking. Not from hunger, from something else. From the overwhelming realization that this bread, this simple piece of bread, revealed a truth that German propaganda had hidden for years. They had been fighting against a country with unlimited resources. A country where bread was still soft and white and available for prisoners. A country that could feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own citizens. Elizabeth looked around the dining hall. Other women were having the same reaction. Some ate slowly, afraid to appear greedy. Some had stopped eating entirely, staring at their trays with expressions of disbelief. Some were crying quietly, tears running down their faces as they chewed bread that tasted like a memory of life before the war. That night, Elizabeth lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. No air raid sirens, no distant explosions, no fear that the building might collapse while she slept. Just silence. Just the sound of 40 women breathing in a room that was warm and dry and safe. She tried to remember the last time she had felt this level of physical security. She could not. The feeling was so foreign that her body did not know how to respond to it. She thought about her family in Germany. Her mother, father, younger brother. Were they alive? Were they eating bread stretched with sawdust while she ate soft white rolls in an enemy prison camp? The guilt hit her like a physical blow. She was a prisoner, yes. But she was a prisoner who was safer and better fed than the free citizens of her own country. What did that mean? What did any of this mean? The days that followed forced Elizabeth to confront answers she did not want to find. She was assigned to the sewing room. She repaired uniforms and clothing for camp personnel. The work was repetitive but familiar. Thread, needle, seam. The same motions she had performed in Germany, but with one crucial difference. Here there was always enough thread, always enough fabric, always enough everything. When something broke, it was replaced. When supplies ran low, more arrived. The abundance was so consistent that Elizabeth eventually stopped noticing it. And that perhaps was the most disturbing realization of all. Abundance could become normal. Scarcity could become a distant memory. The human mind could adapt to anything, even to being treated well by the people you were taught to hate. The guards never hit her. The guards never shouted at her. The guards asked her opinion on whether torn uniforms could be repaired. They asked her opinion. A prisoner. The enemy. They valued her skills enough to consult her. Elizabeth did not know what to do with this information. It did not fit into any framework she had been given for understanding Americans. By the end of her first month, Elizabeth had stopped fearing the guards. She had stopped expecting violence. She had stopped watching the sky for bombers. She had stopped rationing her food in case tomorrow brought nothing. She had become against every expectation something resembling comfortable in an enemy prison camp. And that was when the first letter arrived from Germany. Her mother's handwriting was messy, hurried, barely legible. The letter had taken 6 weeks to arrive. By the time Elizabeth read it, the news was already old. But it did not matter. The contents hit her like artillery fire. The bombing had intensified. Food was almost gone. Her brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch militia of old men and children. Her father was sick with no medicine available. And her mother, writing by candlelight because electricity was unreliable, was asking Elizabeth to pray for them. Elizabeth read the letter 17 times that night. She was eating soft white bread while her family starved. She was sleeping in safety while her brother, barely 16 years old, was being handed a rifle and told to stop the Soviet advance. She was being treated with dignity by enemy guards while her own country collapsed into final desperate chaos. The guilt was unbearable. But so was the truth she could no longer avoid. She was better off as an American prisoner than she had ever been as a German citizen. In Part 2, we will discover what happened when Elizabeth began writing letters back to her family, describing conditions they could not believe. We will witness the shocking moment when German prisoners learned the war had ended and their country had surrendered unconditionally. And we will explore the impossible question that haunted every single prisoner in that camp. What do you do when you no longer hate the enemy? What do you do when you realize the enemy never hated you? And what do you do when you learn that everything you believed about the world was a carefully constructed lie? The answers would change, Elizabeth, forever. And they might change how you think about enemies' nations and the thin line between propaganda and truth. In Part 1, we met Elizabeth, a 23-year-old German woman, a laundry worker. Nobody special. She was captured in December 1944 and transported 6,000 kilometers across the Atlantic to an American prisoner of war camp. When she first saw America, what she witnessed shattered everything she believed. Clean ports, functioning infrastructure, workers who were not afraid, and food, soft white bread that made her cry because her family in Germany was starving on sawdust rations. By the end of her first month, Elizabeth had received a letter from home. Her brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm at 16 years old. Her father was sick with no medicine. Her mother was begging her to pray. Elizabeth was eating better as an American prisoner than her free family in Germany. The guilt was destroying her. But she had no idea that the news about to arrive would make everything infinitely worse. Because in the next few weeks, Elizabeth would learn truths about her country that would force her to question not just the war, but her entire identity as a German. And this is where everything became unbearable. February 1945. The camp received new prisoners almost daily now. Each transport brought women with fresh stories from Germany. And each story was more horrifying than the last. Elizabeth listened in the barracks at night. She heard about cities that no longer existed. Dresden had been firebombed. Over 25,000 civilians dead in a single night. Hamburg was a wasteland. Cologne Cathedral stood alone among ruins because everything around it had been vaporized. The women spoke in whispers as if saying the words too loudly would make them more real. Elizabeth absorbed every detail. She cataloged every destroyed city, every death toll, every account of starvation and chaos. And she felt something growing inside her that she could not name. The new prisoners also brought different stories. Darker stories. Stories that Elizabeth did not want to believe. One night, a woman named Margaret arrived in Elizabeth's barracks. She was older, maybe 40, with gray streaks in her hair, and eyes that seemed to look through walls. Margaret had worked as a clerk in the administrative offices of a camp, not a prisoner of war camp, a different kind of camp. She did not speak for the first 3 days. When she finally did, Elizabeth wished she had stayed silent. Margaret described trains, thousands of people packed into cattle cars. She described selections, lines of human beings sorted into groups. She described chimneys that never stopped smoking. She described numbers tattooed on arms. She described things that Elizabeth's mind refused to process. "You are lying," Elizabeth said. Her voice shook. "That cannot be true. Germans would never do such things." Margaret looked at her with those empty eyes. "I typed the transport manifests. I know exactly how many people arrived. I know exactly how many people left. The numbers never matched. They never matched." Elizabeth did not sleep that night, or the next, or the next. She told herself Margaret was insane. She told herself this was Allied propaganda somehow planted among the prisoners. She told herself that her country, her Germany, the nation of Goethe and Beethoven and Bach, could not possibly have committed the horrors Margaret described. But other prisoners began confirming fragments of the story. A cook who had worked near a camp in Poland, a seamstress whose husband had been transferred to special duties and returned a changed man who never spoke again. A telegraph operator who had seen messages she was ordered to forget. The fragments assembled themselves into a picture Elizabeth could not unsee. She stopped eating for 2 days. The guards noticed. An interpreter was sent to check on her. Elizabeth could not explain. How do you explain that your entire understanding of reality has collapsed? How do you explain that you are beginning to suspect your country committed crimes so vast that words cannot contain them? She told the interpreter she was homesick. It was easier than the truth. But the American guards were not stupid. They had received briefings. They knew what Allied forces were discovering as they pushed into German territory. They knew about the camps. They knew about the systematic murder of millions. And they were watching the German prisoners, carefully waiting to see how they would react when the truth became undeniable. The truth became undeniable on April 15, 1945. That was the day British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen. Newsreel footage was shown to American military personnel. Photographs were distributed. The images were so horrifying that several guards had to leave the screening room. And then, in a decision that would change everything, the camp commander ordered that German prisoners be shown edited versions of the footage. Elizabeth sat in a room with 60 other women. A projector hummed. A screen flickered to life. And for the next 20 minutes, she watched her country die. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Mass graves. Walking skeletons in striped uniforms. Children. Children. Dead children with numbers on their arms. Elizabeth watched until she could not watch anymore. Then she continued watching because looking away felt like betrayal. Several women vomited. Others screamed. Others sat in complete silence, their minds simply shutting down. When the footage ended, nobody moved. The projector continued humming in the empty darkness. Nobody knew what to say because there was nothing to say. Elizabeth walked back to her barracks like a ghost. She lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The soft white bread she had cried over suddenly seemed obscene. She had been feeling guilty about eating well while her family starved. Now she understood that starvation was the least of Germany's crimes. Her country had murdered millions of innocent people, systematically, industrially, with German efficiency and German organization and German record-keeping. The same traits she had been taught to be proud of had been used to orchestrate genocide. How do you continue existing after learning that Elizabeth did not speak for 3 days? When she finally spoke, it was to Margaret. She found the older woman sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at nothing. Elizabeth sat beside her without asking permission. They did not look at each other. "Did you know," Elizabeth asked, "when you worked there, did you know what was happening?" Margaret was silent for a long moment. "I knew something was wrong. I chose not to understand what. That is different from not knowing, and it is not an excuse. What do we do now? We survive. We go home eventually. We rebuild. And we make sure this never happens again. That is all we can do. That is all anyone can do." Elizabeth wanted to argue. She wanted to say that survival was not enough, that rebuilding was not enough, that nothing would ever be enough to atone for what had been done. But she also understood that Margaret was right. The dead could not be brought back. The past could not be changed. The only direction available was forward. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth began to change. She worked harder in the sewing room. She repaired uniforms with careful attention to detail. She followed every rule without complaint. She treated the American guards with something beyond respect. She treated them with gratitude. These men had every reason to hate her. Their friends had died fighting Germany. Their country had been attacked by Germany. And yet they treated prisoners with professional dignity. They did not take revenge. They did not abuse. They simply did their jobs and maintained order. Elizabeth began to understand something about the difference between nations. Germany had been told that Americans were barbaric, uncivilized, brutal. Germany had been told that Jews were subhuman, that Slavs were inferior, that only the Aryan race deserved to exist. Germany had been told lies, and those lies had led to the murder of millions. America, imperfect as it was, had not built death camps. America had not industrialized genocide. America had captured enemy prisoners and fed them soft white bread. The comparison was not complicated. It was painfully, obviously simple. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin. The news reached the American camp within hours. German prisoners received the announcement through interpreters. Some women cried. Some cheered. Some felt nothing at all. Elizabeth belonged to the third group. Hitler had been an abstraction to her, a voice on the radio, a face on posters. His death meant the war was ending, but it did not undo anything. The damage was permanent. The dead would stay dead. The camps had existed. No bullet through Hitler's brain could change that. 1 week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had killed 60 million people was finally over. American guards celebrated. Some prisoners celebrated too relieved that the dying had stopped. Others sat in silence contemplating what came next. Elizabeth was among the silent ones. She understood that surrender meant she would eventually go home. But what was home now? A destroyed country that had committed unspeakable crimes. A family she had not seen in 6 months. A future she could not imagine. The weeks after VE Day brought strange changes to the camp. Rules relaxed slightly. Food improved marginally. The guards seemed less tense. But the fundamental reality remained unchanged. The prisoners were still prisoners. America still controlled their lives. Home was still an ocean away. And the process of repatriation would take months, perhaps years, given the sheer number of prisoners scattered across American territory. Elizabeth used this time to write letters. She wrote to her mother every week. She described the camp, the food, the work. She did not describe the newsreel footage. She did not describe what she had learned about the camps. Some truths could not be transmitted through letters. Some truths required presence, required eye contact, required the kind of communication that transcended words. Her mother's replies arrived irregularly, delayed by the chaos of post-war Europe. Each letter painted a picture of destruction. The family home had survived, but barely. Food was still scarce. Her father's health had not improved. Her brother had survived the final weeks of fighting, but something inside him had died. He did not speak. He did not eat unless forced. He stared at walls and sometimes screamed in his sleep. Elizabeth read these letters and felt the impossibility of her situation. She was safe-fed and physically healthy in an enemy prison camp. Her family was free, but starving, sick, and traumatized in what remained of Germany. Which was worse? She could not decide. She was not sure the question had an answer. Summer 1945 brought heat to the camp. Elizabeth worked in the sewing room with windows open, feeling American sunshine on her skin. She had been a prisoner for 7 months now. The routines had become so familiar that she sometimes forgot she was not free. Wake at 6 Hydro. Breakfast at 6:30. Work at 7 Hydro. Lunch at 12 Hydro. Work until 5 Hydro. Dinner at 6 Hydro. Free time until 9 Hydro. Lights out at 10 Hydro. Every day the same. Every day predictable. Every day safe. She had stopped fearing the guards entirely. She knew their names now. Sergeant Morrison, who always nodded politely when he passed the sewing room. Private Williams, who once helped her carry a heavy box of fabric. Corporal Henderson, who spoke a few words of German and sometimes practiced with the prisoners. These were not monsters. These were young men far from home, doing a job they had not asked for, treating their enemies with surprising humanity. Elizabeth wondered what German guards had treated American prisoners like. She had heard rumors, bad rumors, starvation, beatings, forced marches, executions. She could not verify these rumors, but they seemed consistent with everything else she had learned about her country's behavior during the war. Germany had waged a war of annihilation. America had waged a war of liberation. The difference was not subtle. By August 1945, news arrived that Japan had surrendered after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The entire war was finally over. Every front, every theater, every battlefield. The killing had stopped everywhere. Elizabeth heard the news and felt only exhaustion. She had lived through the most destructive war in human history. She had seen her country rise and fall and commit atrocities that would haunt humanity forever. She had eaten soft white bread in an enemy prison camp while her family starved. She had watched footage of death camps and looked into the abyss of what her nation had become. What was there left to feel? The answer came slowly. It came through routine. It came through letters. It came through small kindnesses from guards and fellow prisoners. It came through the simple fact that each day she woke up alive, and each day offered another chance to exist. Elizabeth began to understand that survival was not just physical. Survival was choosing to continue. Survival was finding meaning in work and connection. Survival was accepting that the past could not be changed while still believing that the future could be different. She began helping other prisoners who struggled, women who could not stop crying, women who had stopped eating, women who talked about not wanting to continue. Elizabeth sat with them. She listened. She did not offer solutions because there were no solutions. She simply offered presence, and sometimes presence was enough. By September 1945, the first repatriation transports began, not for Elizabeth's camp yet, but for others. The process would take over a year to complete. 425,000 German prisoners in America would eventually return to Europe. Each one would face the challenge of rebuilding a life in a destroyed country. Each one would carry memories of captivity that would shape them forever. And each one would have to answer the same impossible question. How do you go home when home no longer exists? Elizabeth did not know when her turn would come. She did not know what she would find when she finally reached Germany. She did not know if her family would survive the coming winter, or if her brother would ever recover, or if her father would live to see her again. She did not know anything about her future, except one thing. She would survive, she would return, she would rebuild, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure that what Germany had done would never be forgotten and never be repeated. But Elizabeth did not know what was waiting in Part 3. She did not know that repatriation would bring challenges she had never imagined. She did not know that returning to Germany would mean facing neighbors who had participated in the regime, family members who refused to acknowledge what had happened, and a society that wanted desperately to forget. She did not know that the lessons she had learned in America about dignity, about humanity, about the importance of treating enemies with respect would be rejected by people who wanted only to move forward without looking back. And she did not know that the most difficult fight of her life was not surviving the war or surviving captivity. The most difficult fight would be surviving peace, surviving memory, surviving the knowledge of what her country had done and what it would take to atone. In Part 3, we will follow Elizabeth's journey home across a devastated Atlantic. We will witness her first sight of post-war Germany, a landscape of rubble and refugees and shame. We will meet the family members she had not seen in over a year and discover how captivity and war had changed them all. And we will explore the impossible challenge of rebuilding a life in a nation that wanted to forget its crimes, while Elizabeth knew that forgetting was the one thing they could never afford to do. The war was over. But for Elizabeth, the real battle was just beginning. In Part 1, Elizabeth was captured. A 23-year-old German laundry worker transported 6,000 kilometers across the Atlantic to an American prisoner of war camp. She arrived expecting brutality. Instead, she found soft white-bread professional guards and a nation untouched by bombing. In Part 2, the truth destroyed her. She watched newsreel footage of Bergen-Belsen. She learned what her country had done. She saw the death camps, the mass graves, the skeletal survivors. She understood that Germany had committed crimes so vast that words could not contain them. When the war ended in May 1945, Elizabeth knew she would eventually go home. But home no longer existed. Not really. The Germany she had left was gone forever, and the Germany waiting for her was a wasteland of rubble, shame, and silence. Now in late 1945, the repatriation ships were finally being organized. Elizabeth's name appeared on a transport manifest. She was going back. But she had no idea that returning home would be harder than leaving it. And this is where the real nightmare began. The repatriation process was not fast. It could not be fast. The United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war scattered across hundreds of camps. Moving them back to Europe required ships' logistics coordination with Allied occupation forces and bureaucratic processes that moved at glacial speed. Elizabeth waited through summer and autumn of 1945. She watched other prisoners leave. She continued working in the sewing room. She continued writing letters to her mother, and she continued preparing herself for a homecoming she could not imagine. Her turn came in November 1945, almost exactly 1 year after her capture. The announcement arrived on a Tuesday. Elizabeth's name was read aloud, along with 47 other women from her barracks. They would depart in 3 days. They would travel by train to a port on the East Coast. They would board a ship bound for Europe. They would be processed through Allied-controlled territory in France. And then finally, they would be released into what remained of Germany. Elizabeth packed her small bag, the same bag she had carried when captured. Hairbrush, comb, 1 extra shirt. She had acquired a few additional items during her captivity. A photograph of her barracks mates. A small notebook where she had written observations about American life. A letter from Margaret, the older woman who had worked at the camp, who had been repatriated 3 months earlier and had written to say she was alive but struggling. The train journey took 2 days. Elizabeth stared out the window at American landscape passing by. Cities that had never been bombed, farms that had never been burned, roads that had never been cratered by artillery. She tried to memorize the sight of normalcy because she knew she would not see it again for a very long time. The other women on the train were quiet. Some slept. Some cried. Some stared at nothing, already mentally preparing for what awaited them. The ship was smaller than the vessel that had brought Elizabeth to America. It was crowded but functional. The voyage would take approximately 2 weeks, depending on weather and route. Elizabeth found a bunk in a compartment with 20 other women. She claimed a lower bed near a small porthole. Through that porthole, she watched America disappear behind the horizon. She watched the Atlantic stretch out in every direction. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Fear. Not fear of the ocean. Not fear of the journey. Fear of arrival. Fear of what she would find. Fear of who she would become when she stepped back onto German soil. The crossing was rough. November Atlantic weather brought storms that tossed the ship like a toy. Many women became seasick. Elizabeth did not. She had developed a strange physical resilience during her captivity. She ate when food was available. She slept when sleep was possible. She endured discomfort without complaint. These were survival skills she had learned in the camp. They would serve her well in the months ahead. During the voyage, Elizabeth spent hours talking with other women. They shared stories of captivity. They compared experiences of American camps. They discussed what they expected to find at home. Most expected the worst: destroyed houses, dead relatives, starvation conditions, occupation by foreign armies. None of them expected things to be easy, but none of them truly understood how difficult things would be. One woman named Helga had received letters indicating that her entire family had died. Parents, siblings, husband, children, everyone. She was returning to nothing. Literally nothing. No home, no family, no reason to exist except the biological imperative to continue breathing. Elizabeth watched Helga stare at the ocean for hours at a time. She understood that Helga was calculating whether the water might be preferable to the land. Elizabeth sat with her. She did not speak. She simply sat. Sometimes presence was all you could offer. Sometimes presence was enough to keep someone from climbing over a railing. But the greatest challenge was not the voyage. It was what came after. The ship docked at Le Havre, France, in late November 1945. The port showed extensive war damage, but it was functional. Allied military personnel processed the arriving prisoners with efficiency. Papers were checked, names were verified, health inspections were conducted. And then, after hours of waiting, Elizabeth was officially released from prisoner of war status. She was free. The word meant nothing. Free to go where, free to do what. She had no money. She had no transportation. She had no clear path to her hometown, which was over 600 kilometers away in a part of Germany now occupied by American forces. She had only her small bag, her camp-issued clothing, and a repatriation document that theoretically entitled her to assistance. The assistance was minimal. Allied authorities provided former prisoners with basic rations and transportation vouchers. Elizabeth received enough food for 3 days and a voucher for train travel within the Allied occupation zones. The trains, she was warned, were unreliable. Routes had been destroyed. Schedules were theoretical. A journey that might have taken 12 hours before the war could now take 3 days or more. Elizabeth began walking toward the train station. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not literal silence. There were sounds everywhere. Trucks, voices, machinery. But underneath those sounds was an absence of normalcy, an absence of the ordinary rhythm of civilian life. Everyone she passed looked tired, worn, defeated. French civilians, German refugees, Allied soldiers. Everyone carried the same expression of exhausted endurance. The train station was chaos. Hundreds of people crowded platforms designed for dozens. Trains arrived randomly, sometimes hours late, sometimes not at all. Elizabeth found a corner and sat down to wait. She waited for 6 hours before a train heading east finally appeared. She pushed through the crowd and managed to claim a space in a car so packed that standing was the only option. The train moved slowly. It stopped frequently. At each stop, more people tried to board. At some stops, people were forced off to make room for military personnel or priority cargo. Elizabeth held her position through determination and physical stubbornness. She had survived a year of captivity. She could survive a train journey. But what she saw through the windows broke something inside her. Germany was destroyed, not damaged. Destroyed. Cities she passed through were unrecognizable. Cologne, Frankfurt. Each name conjured memories of photographs and stories from before the war. Grand buildings, beautiful churches, thriving streets. Now there was only rubble. Mountains of rubble. Rubble as far as the eye could see. Occasionally, a wall would stand alone, a building's facade with nothing behind it, like a theatrical set left over from a play about civilization. People lived in the rubble. She could see them moving through the destroyed streets. Women carrying buckets. Children playing on piles of bricks. Old men sitting in the shells of buildings that had once been homes. Life continued in the ruins because life had no other choice. The train stopped in Frankfurt for 7 hours. Elizabeth left the station to find food. Her rations were running low. She walked through streets that had been turned into canyons of destruction. She saw women clearing rubble with their bare hands. She saw children begging for food from Allied soldiers. She saw former soldiers still in tattered uniforms sitting on broken walls with empty eyes. And everywhere she saw signs. Signs in English, French, Russian. Signs indicating occupation zones. Signs directing traffic. Signs announcing curfews. Germany was not a country anymore. Germany was a territory administered by foreign powers who had defeated it completely and utterly. Elizabeth found a distribution point where refugees could receive soup. She waited in line for 2 hours. The soup was thin, mostly water with a few vegetables floating in it. She drank it gratefully. It was more than many people had. That night, she slept in the train station. Hundreds of others did the same, bodies packed together for warmth on cold concrete floors. Elizabeth used her bag as a pillow and her coat as a blanket. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Sleep was survival. The next day, she continued her journey. Her hometown was in the American occupation zone. This was fortunate. She had heard stories about the Soviet zone, stories of violence, of revenge, of systematic brutality. The American zone was not paradise, but it was safer. The same Americans who had treated her well as a prisoner were now administering the region where her family lived. The final leg of her journey took another 2 days. Trains. Walking. More trains. She navigated through checkpoints where Allied soldiers examined her documents. She answered questions in broken English and halting German. She moved through a landscape of destruction toward a destination she could barely remember. When she finally reached her hometown, she stopped walking. She stood at the edge of what had once been the main street. She recognized nothing. The church where she had been baptized was a pile of stones. The school where she had learned to read was a burned shell. The bakery where her mother had bought bread every morning no longer existed. The entire geography of her childhood had been erased. Elizabeth walked through the town like a ghost. She searched for familiar landmarks. She found fragments. A fountain that still stood though cracked and dry. A statue that had lost its head but remained on its pedestal. A single wall of the town hall with the clock still attached, though the hands had stopped at 3:47 frozen at the moment when bombs had ended time itself. She found her family's street. The house was still there, damaged but standing. The roof had been partially destroyed and covered with salvaged materials. The windows were boarded up. The garden where her mother had grown vegetables was now bare earth, but the structure remained. The walls that had contained her childhood still existed. Elizabeth stood outside for 5 minutes. She could not move. She could not knock. She could not announce her presence. What if no one was inside? What if everyone was dead? What if the family she remembered no longer existed? The door opened. Her mother stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither woman moved. They stared at each other across 3 meters of broken ground. Elizabeth saw that her mother had aged 20 years in the 12 months since they had last seen each other. Her hair was completely gray now. Her face was lined with exhaustion and grief. Her body was thin, too thin, the body of someone who had not eaten properly in a very long time. Then her mother screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of recognition, of disbelief, of joy so overwhelming that it could only exit the body as sound. She ran toward Elizabeth. She grabbed her daughter with arms that had lost their strength, but not their love. She held on as if releasing her grip would make Elizabeth disappear again. Elizabeth held her mother. She felt the bones beneath the skin. She smelled the unwashed hair and the smoke that seemed to have permeated everything in Germany. She heard her mother sobbing against her shoulder, and she understood in that moment that she had survived. Against all probability, against all expectation, she had survived the war, survived captivity, survived the journey home. And her mother had survived too. They stood in the street holding each other for a long time. Eventually, her mother led her inside. The house was cold. There was no heat. Fuel was almost impossible to obtain. The family survived on whatever could be scavenged or traded for. Elizabeth met her father, who was bedridden, now weakened by illness and malnutrition. He recognized her, but could barely speak. She met her brother, who sat in a corner and did not look up when she entered. He was 16 years old, but looked like an old man. His eyes were empty. His hands trembled constantly. He had seen things in the final weeks of the war that had destroyed something essential inside him. This was her family now. A dying father, a traumatized brother, an exhausted mother, and Elizabeth herself carrying knowledge about German crimes that she could not share, and American kindness that would not be believed. That first night, Elizabeth lay on a mattress on the floor of her childhood bedroom. The room was exactly as she had left it, except colder and darker and emptier. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence of a destroyed town. No traffic, no electricity, no normal sounds of civilization. Just whined through broken windows and the occasional distant sound of Allied vehicles patrolling streets that had once been German. She thought about the camp in America, the soft white bread, the warm sewing room, the guards who nodded politely, the routine that had given her life structure and predictability. She had been a prisoner there, but she had been safe, fed, treated with dignity. Here she was free, and freedom meant cold hunger, uncertainty, and the slow work of rebuilding a life from nothing. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to Elizabeth in the months and years after her return. We will see how she struggled to rebuild her life in occupied Germany. We will learn what happened to her father, her brother, her mother. We will explore the impossible challenge of processing what Germany had done while trying to create a future worth living. And we will answer the question that has been building throughout this entire story. What does it mean to survive? Not just physically survive, but to survive with your humanity intact, to survive with hope, to survive with the ability to love, to trust, to believe that the future can be better than the past. Elizabeth's story is almost complete. But the final chapter contains lessons that are still relevant today. Lessons about enemies and humanity. Lessons about guilt and forgiveness. Lessons about the thin line between civilization and barbarism. And lessons about what it truly means to come home. The war was over. The journey was complete. But for Elizabeth, the hardest work was just beginning. In Part 1, Elizabeth was captured. A 23-year-old German laundry worker who had never fired a weapon. She was transported 6,000 kilometers across the Atlantic Ocean to an American prisoner of war camp. What she found there shattered everything she believed about the enemy. Soft white bread, professional guards, a nation untouched by bombing. In Part 2, she learned the horrifying truth about her own country. She watched newsreel footage of Bergen-Belsen. She understood that Germany had committed genocide on an industrial scale. When the war ended, she carried knowledge that would haunt her forever. In Part 3, she came home. She traveled through a destroyed Europe, through cities reduced to rubble, through a landscape of refugees and despair. She found her family broken, her father dying, her brother traumatized beyond speech, her mother aged beyond recognition. Elizabeth had survived the war. She had survived captivity. She had survived the journey home. But now came the hardest question of all. How do you rebuild a life when everything you knew has been destroyed? How do you move forward when your country committed unspeakable crimes? And how do you reconcile the kindness of your enemies with the cruelty of your own people? This final chapter contains truths that most people have never heard. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was the hardest winter Elizabeth had ever experienced. Not because of the cold, though the cold was brutal. Not because of the hunger, though hunger was constant. The hardest part was watching her family disintegrate while being powerless to stop it. Her father died in January 1946. He simply stopped breathing one night. No dramatic final words. No peaceful closure. Just silence, where there had been shallow breathing. Elizabeth and her mother buried him in a cemetery that had been partially destroyed by bombing. They could not afford a proper headstone. They marked the grave with a wooden cross that Elizabeth carved herself using tools salvaged from the ruins of a neighbor's workshop. Her brother did not attend the funeral. He could not leave the house. He could not function in any normal capacity. The things he had seen in the final weeks of the war, the things he had been forced to do as a 16-year-old conscript in the Volkssturm, had destroyed something essential in his mind. He sat in corners. He flinched at sudden sounds. He sometimes screamed in his sleep with such violence that neighbors complained. There was no psychiatric care available. There were no medications. There was only endurance. Elizabeth became the provider. She found work wherever she could. Clearing rubble for the reconstruction crews. Washing clothes for American occupation soldiers. Sewing uniforms, the same work she had done as a prisoner, now done as a free woman for the same military that had once captured her. The irony was not lost on her. She earned money in occupation currency. She traded labor for food. She kept her family alive through sheer determination. Her mother lasted until 1948. 3 years of starvation, grief, and exhaustion finally overwhelmed her body. She died in her sleep, just like her husband. Elizabeth buried her in the same cemetery next to her father, with another wooden cross carved by her own hands. At 27 years old, Elizabeth was effectively orphaned. Her brother remained her responsibility. He never fully recovered. He could eventually function well enough to perform simple tasks. Sweeping, carrying, basic physical labor. But he never spoke about the war. He never formed relationships. He never married. He lived with Elizabeth until his own death in 1971, a middle-aged man with the eyes of a frightened child. Elizabeth cared for him without complaint. It was simply what family did. But Elizabeth herself found something unexpected in the ruins of post-war Germany. She found purpose. She began speaking to other women who had returned from American captivity. She discovered that her experience was not unique. Thousands of German women had been held in American camps. Almost all of them reported similar treatment: professional guards, adequate food, systematic processing, humane conditions. These women carried the same cognitive dissonance that Elizabeth carried. They had been taught that Americans were barbarians. They had experienced Americans as disciplined professionals who followed rules and treated prisoners with dignity. Elizabeth began writing. At first, just personal notes, observations about her captivity, comparisons between American treatment and what she had learned about German treatment of prisoners. She wrote about the soft white bread. She wrote about the guards who nodded politely. She wrote about the moment she first saw the American port and understood that her country had been fighting a war it could never win. These writings eventually became something more. In the 1950s, as Germany began to rebuild and reflect on its past, Elizabeth contributed to oral history projects documenting the experiences of German prisoners of war. Her testimony was recorded. Her observations were catalogued. Her perspective became part of the historical record. She never became famous. She never received recognition beyond small academic circles. She remained Elizabeth, a seamstress, a caregiver for her damaged brother, an ordinary woman who had witnessed extraordinary things. But her legacy was not about fame. Her legacy was about truth. The American prisoner of war system processed approximately 425,000 German prisoners during World War II. These prisoners were held in over 500 camps across the United States. They worked in agriculture, manufacturing, and various support roles. They were fed, housed, and treated according to the Geneva Convention. When the war ended, they were repatriated to Europe. Almost all of them survived. Compare this to German treatment of prisoners. Soviet prisoners of war held by Germany experienced a mortality rate of approximately 57%. 57%. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by German forces, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity. They were starved. They were worked to death. They were executed. They were treated as subhuman because Nazi ideology classified them as subhuman. American prisoners held by Germany fared better, but still experienced significant mortality. Approximately 1% of American POWs died in German captivity. This was largely due to international pressure and German awareness that their own prisoners in American hands would be treated according to how they treated American prisoners. The contrast reveals something profound about nations and systems. America chose to follow rules. America chose to treat enemies as human beings deserving of basic dignity. This was not because Americans were inherently superior. It was because American institutions, American laws, and American military culture demanded certain standards of behavior. The system constrained individual cruelty. The system enforced basic humanity. Germany under Nazi ideology had systematically dismantled these constraints. The result was industrial murder on a scale unprecedented in human history. Elizabeth understood this contrast intimately. She had experienced American detention. She had learned about German atrocities. She spent the rest of her life trying to understand how two nations both populated by human beings could behave so differently. The answer, she eventually concluded, was not about individuals. It was about systems. It was about what institutions permit and what they forbid. It was about whether a society builds structures that constrain its worst impulses or structures that amplify them. This insight remains relevant today. 79 years after World War II ended, the fundamental question persists. How do we build institutions that bring out the best in human beings rather than the worst? How do we create systems that enforce dignity even when individuals might prefer cruelty? How do we maintain humanity in situations that tempt us toward barbarism? Elizabeth never answered these questions definitively. Nobody has. but she spent her life grappling with them, and her testimony, preserved in archives and oral history collections, continues to inform historians, ethicists, and policymakers who wrestle with the same issues. The legacy of the American POW system extends far beyond World War II. The principles established during that conflict, the emphasis on following international law, treating prisoners humanely, and maintaining professional standards, influenced American military doctrine for decades. The lessons learned about mass detention logistics and repatriation were applied in Korea, in Vietnam, and in subsequent conflicts. More importantly, the contrast between American and German treatment of prisoners became a foundational example in discussions of military ethics. It demonstrated that civilized warfare was possible, that rules mattered, that how you treat enemies reveals who you truly are. German prisoners who returned from American captivity carried these lessons with them. Many of them, like Elizabeth, contributed to the reconstruction of German society with a different perspective than those who had never experienced foreign captivity. They had seen that enemies could be humane. They had learned that brutality was a choice, not an inevitability. They brought this understanding into the new Germany that emerged from the ashes of the Third Reich. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, was built on principles deliberately opposed to Nazi ideology. Human dignity was enshrined in the first article of the new Constitution. The rule of law was emphasized. Democratic institutions were constructed with checks and balances designed to prevent the concentration of power that had enabled Nazi atrocities. Former prisoners of war, including women like Elizabeth, were part of the generation that built this new Germany. Their experiences informed their values. Their understanding of what could go wrong shaped their determination to build something better. This is the true legacy of Elizabeth's story. Not the soft white bread, or the professional guards, or the newsreel footage that shattered her world. The true legacy is the knowledge that systems matter, that institutions shape behavior, that how nations treat their most vulnerable, including enemy prisoners, reveals the character of those nations. But there is one final detail that most people have never heard. One revelation that adds a remarkable twist to this entire story. In 2017, researchers at the University of Heidelberg completed a comprehensive study of German women who had been held in American prisoner of war camps. They located surviving former prisoners now in their 90s and conducted extensive interviews about their experiences. They also examined letters, diaries, and documents that had been preserved for over 70 years. Among these documents was a collection of letters written by Elizabeth between 1946 and 1952. The letters had been donated to the University Archive by her brother's estate after his death in 1971. Elizabeth herself had died in 1989 at the age of 68, still living in the same rebuilt hometown where she had been born. The letters revealed something extraordinary. In 1947, Elizabeth had attempted to locate one of the American guards who had worked at her camp. His name was Sergeant Thomas Morrison. She remembered him because he had been one of the guards who showed consistent courtesy toward prisoners. He had nodded to her in the hallways. He had once helped her carry a heavy box of fabric. Small gestures that meant nothing to him, but meant everything to her. Elizabeth wrote to the American military seeking information about Morrison. She received a response indicating that Sergeant Morrison had been discharged and returned to civilian life in Pennsylvania. She wrote to him directly. Morrison wrote back. The correspondence continued for 5 years. Morrison described his experiences guarding German prisoners. He explained that he had simply been doing his job according to training and regulations. He had no particular sympathy for Germany. His brother had been killed fighting in Italy. But he had been taught that prisoners were human beings deserving of professional treatment. He had followed those teachings. Elizabeth described her experiences returning to Germany. She told Morrison about the destruction, the starvation, the slow death of her family. She thanked him for the small courtesies he had shown her. She explained that those courtesies had helped her survive the transition from prisoner to witness to survivor. The correspondence ended in 1952, when Morrison died of cancer at the age of 42. His widow, cleaning out his belongings, found the letters from Germany and threw them away without reading them. Elizabeth never knew what happened to him. She continued writing for several months before concluding that he had simply stopped responding. But the letters she wrote, preserved in that German archive, reveal something profound about human connection across the divide of war. An American guard and a German prisoner, enemies by circumstance, had found common ground through simple courtesy and shared humanity. Their brief correspondence demonstrated that the divisions created by war were not permanent. That understanding was possible, that even in the aftermath of the worst conflict in human history, individuals could reach across boundaries and recognize each other as human beings. This is what Elizabeth's story teaches us. This is why her experience matters 79 years later. From a 23-year-old laundry worker captured in the chaos of 1944, to a witness of American decency, to a survivor of German destruction, to a keeper of memory who spent her entire life trying to understand what she had experienced. Elizabeth's journey encompasses the full range of human possibility: the capacity for industrial murder, the capacity for institutional kindness, the capacity for individual connection across the deepest divides. The American prisoner of war system processed 425,000 German prisoners. The vast majority survived and returned home. Many of them, like Elizabeth, carried lessons that influenced the reconstruction of Germany and the development of post-war European values. The system was not perfect, but it was humane. It followed rules. It treated enemies as human beings. That choice, made by American military planners and executed by individual soldiers like Sergeant Morrison, rippled forward through decades. It shaped how survivors understood their experiences. It influenced how Germany rebuilt itself. It provided a counterexample to Nazi brutality that informed discussions of military ethics for generations. Elizabeth never became famous. Her name does not appear in history textbooks. Her photograph does not hang in museums. She was one woman among millions, her story one thread in the vast tapestry of World War II. But her story matters. It matters because it reminds us that wars are fought by human beings, that enemies are human beings, that the choices made in moments of power reveal the character of individuals and nations. It matters because it demonstrates that decency is possible even in the worst circumstances, that systems can enforce humanity, that individuals can show courtesy that transcends ideology. And it matters because the questions Elizabeth grappled with remain unanswered. How do we build institutions that constrain cruelty? How do we maintain dignity in situations that tempt barbarism? How do we treat our enemies in ways that we can be proud of when the fighting stops? These questions did not end with World War II. They persist today. They will persist tomorrow. Every generation must answer them anew. Elizabeth answered them with her life. She survived. She endured. She remembered. She bore witness. And she demonstrated through decades of quiet perseverance that ordinary people can carry extraordinary burdens without losing their humanity. If you found this story meaningful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. History is full of forgotten witnesses whose experiences contain lessons we desperately need. Elizabeth was one of 425,000 German prisoners in America. Each of them had a story. Most of those stories are lost forever, but the lessons remain. How we treat the powerless reveals who we truly are. How we treat enemies reveals what we truly value. And how we remember the past shapes what kind of future we can build. Elizabeth understood this. She lived it. And now, 79 years after she first saw America from the deck of a prisoner transport ship, her story has finally been told. Remember her. Remember what she witnessed. Remember what she learned. Because the choice between humanity and barbarism is never made once and finished. It is made every day in every institution by every individual with power over others. Choose wisely. The future depends on it.